was on the last stretch of my road trip, the road dark and empty as I sped through the desert highway. I'd been driving for hours, hoping to make it to the next town by midnight, but out here, it was hard to tell if I'd make it. My phone was dead, and I hadn't seen a gas station for miles. Then, just like that, my heart sank as the gas light blinked on. I still had at least 20 miles to the next town, maybe more. I tried to keep calm, telling myself I'd make it. I turned off the AC to save fuel and kept my speed steady, but my nerves were already creeping in. The night felt thicker and darker, the wind whistling past my car as if it knew something I didn't. After 10 miles of watching the gas needle dip lower and lower, my car started to sputter. I cursed under my breath, my grip tightening on the steering wheel. The car jerked forward, slowing, and then came to a complete stop. The engine fell silent, and I was left alone, stranded, in the middle of nowhere. I sat there in the darkness, trying to decide what to do. I could wait and hope another car passed by, or I could walk. But where? I didn't know how far it was to the next town, and the desert was pitch black beyond my headlights. I took out my flashlight and stepped out of the car, the door creaking as it closed behind me. The desert was eerily quiet, the wind carrying only the faint sound of rustling leaves and shifting sand. There was a small path off to the right, barely visible in the dark, leading away from the highway into a cluster of trees. I figured maybe it would lead somewhere, maybe a farmhouse, maybe a cabin, anywhere with someone who... I decided to follow the path. As I walked, the air grew colder, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I tried to push the thought away, but every snap of a twig or rustle of a leaf made me stop and look around, my heart pounding in my chest. The path wound through trees that seemed to close in around me, their twisted branches reaching overhead like claws. After a while, I saw a faint glow in the distance, a light just barely visible through the trees. I picked up my pace, hoping it was a house, but when I got closer, I saw it was just a lantern hanging from a tree, swaying gently in the wind. I shined my flashlight around, searching for any sign of a house or cabin, but there was nothing, only the lonely lantern casting an orange glow over the dirt path. I stared at it, wondering who had put it there and why. I reached up to touch it, and as I did, the wind suddenly died down. The night fell completely silent. A chill ran down my spine, and I felt an overwhelming urge to get out of there. I turned to head back to my car, but as I took a step, I heard a sound behind me, a slow, steady crunching, like footsteps in the dirt. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't want to look back, but something made me turn. The path behind me was empty, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger, as if eyes were staring at me from the shadows. I started walking, faster this time, trying to ignore the creeping sense of dread, but then I heard it again, the footsteps, closer this time, as if someone or something was following me. I broke into a run, my flashlight bouncing in my hand, casting erratic beams of light across the trees. I didn't know where I was going, I just knew I had to get away. The footsteps grew louder, closing in on me, until I could almost feel someone's breath on the back of my neck. I burst out of the trees and stumbled onto a small clearing, gasping for air. In front of me was an old, abandoned gas station, its windows cracked and its walls covered in peeling paint. A single flickering light hung above the entrance, casting eerie shadows across the ground. I hurried to the door and tried the handle, but it was locked. I banged on the door, hoping someone, anyone, might be inside, but there was no answer. The footsteps had stopped, but I could still feel that presence behind me, watching me from the trees. Desperate, I moved around to the side of the building, searching for another way in. I found a broken window, the glass scattered on the ground, and carefully climbed through. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of dust and oil, and my footsteps echoed in the empty space. I shined my flashlight around, hoping to find a phone or a working gas pump, but the place looked like it hadn't been used in years. The shelves were empty, the counters covered in a layer of grime. I went behind the counter and found an old landline phone, covered in cobwebs. I picked up the receiver, but there was no dial tone. Frustrated, I slammed the phone down and leaned against the counter, trying to think of my next move. That's when I heard it, a faint scratching sound coming from the back room. I held my breath, listening as the sound grew louder, like nails scraping against wood. I wanted to run, but my feet felt glued to the floor. The scratching continued, slow and deliberate, as if whatever was back there knew I was listening. I raised my flashlight and slowly crept toward the door leading to the back room. The door was slightly ajar, and as I got closer, I could see something moving in the shadows. I pushed the door open and shined my light into the room. At first, I didn't see anything, just a few old storage boxes and a rusted gas canister. But then, in the corner, I saw it. A figure crouched low to the ground, its back to me, its hands scratching at the floor. It looked human, but there was something wrong with it. Its limbs were too long, its skin pale and stretched tight over its bones. I took a step back, my heart pounding, but the figure suddenly stopped scratching and turned its head slowly to look at me. Its eyes were hollow, black pits, and its mouth twisted into a smile that sent a chill through my entire body. I stumbled backward, dropping my flashlight as I scrambled to get away. The figure rose to its feet, moving in a jerky, unnatural way, its head tilting to one side as it watched me. I turned and ran, sprinting back through the gas station and out into the clearing. The flickering light above the entrance cast my shadow across the ground as I stumbled toward the road, desperate to get back to my car. I didn't stop running until I reached the trees, but when I looked back, the gas station was gone. The clearing was empty, the lantern in the tree was gone, and the path I had followed had vanished. I was back on the road, my car just a few yards away, as if I'd never left. I climbed inside, locked the doors, and tried to catch my breath. I sat there in the silence. The memory of that twisted figure burned into my mind. In the distance, I saw headlights approaching. A truck slowly pulled up beside me, and the driver rolled down his window. "Need some help?" he asked, his voice kind and steady. I nodded, still too shaken to speak. The driver got out and siphoned some gas into my tank from a can he had in the back of his truck. He didn't ask any questions, and I didn't offer any explanations. When my car started again, I thanked him and got back on the road, leaving that dark, empty stretch of highway behind me. I never looked back, and I've never taken that road again. But sometimes, late at night, I can still feel those hollow eyes watching me from the darkness, waiting for the next traveler to run out of gas. The car was almost out of gas. I'd been driving for hours on an empty highway, nothing around but desert and dark sky. I hadn't seen another car in ages, and I'd missed the last gas station miles back, thinking there'd be another one soon. But as the gas needle dropped lower and lower, it became clear that I'd made a big mistake. My phone had no signal, and even if it did, the battery was almost dead. I kept driving, hoping against hope I'd find some place to refuel, but as I rounded a bend, the car sputtered and the engine cut off completely, leaving me stranded. I coasted to a stop, cursing under my breath. This was the last place I wanted to be, alone in the desert at night with no one around to help. The silence was heavy, broken only by the occasional gust of wind that swept across the desert, carrying with it a cold, empty feeling. I stepped out of the car, my flashlight in hand, and looked down the road. Far off in the distance, I thought I saw a faint light. Maybe it was a gas station, or a house. Anything would be better than sitting here and waiting. With no other choice, I started walking toward the light. The road stretched out in front of me, a long, lonely path that seemed to go on forever. The stars above were bright, but they gave off little light, leaving everything shrouded in darkness. My flashlight barely pierced the night, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, feeling as if something might be following me. As I walked, the light ahead grew closer. It was small and flickering, like a lantern. It hung from a metal sign by the side of the road, casting an eerie glow on the ground. I could see words on the sign: "Last stop inn, vacancy." An inn out here? It seemed strange, almost like it didn't belong, but I was exhausted, and at least it would be a place to rest until I could figure out what to do. I stepped off the road and walked up the path leading to the building. The inn was old and run down, with peeling paint and windows covered in grime. It looked like it hadn't been used in years. I hesitated, but the door swung open with a creak before I could knock. Inside, a dim light flickered from a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. The front desk was covered in dust, and there was a bell on the counter, though it looked like it hadn't been used in ages. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing through the empty room. No one answered. I rang the bell, and its sharp sound broke the silence. After a few moments, A door behind the desk creaked open, and a tall, thin man stepped out. His skin was pale, and he looked like he hadn't slept in days. He wore an old-fashioned suit that seemed too big for him, hanging off his bony frame. "Need a room?" he asked in a low, gravelly voice, his eyes fixed on me. Yes," I stammered, suddenly unsure if this was a good idea. My car ran out of gas a few miles back. "I just need a place to stay for the night." The man nodded slowly and reached under the counter, pulling out a key. He slid it across to me without a word, and I picked it up, feeling a chill run down my spine as our fingers brushed. "Room 7, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "End of the hall." I muttered a thank you and made my way down the narrow hallway. The walls were lined with faded wallpaper, and the carpet was stained and threadbare. There were only a few rooms, each door marked with a tarnished brass number. I found room 7 at the end of the hall, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. The room was small, with a bed, a nightstand, and a single dusty lamp. It smelled musty, like it hadn't been cleaned in years. I turned on the lamp, and it flickered a few times before casting a dim yellow light across the room. I was too tired to care about the state of the place. I sat on the bed, took off my shoes, and lay back, trying to ignore the creaking of the mattress. Just as I was starting to relax, I heard a sound. It was faint at first, like a soft whisper, coming from somewhere down the hall. I held my breath, straining to listen. The whisper grew louder, turning into a low, raspy voice that seemed to be saying something, though I couldn't make out the words. I sat up, my heart pounding. I glanced at the door, half expecting someone to be standing there, but it was closed. I told myself it was just my imagination. The inn was old, and old buildings made strange noises. But the whisper continued, growing louder, and soon it sounded like several voices, all whispering at once, overlapping and mixing together in a disturbing chorus. I couldn't take it anymore. I got up, opened the door, and looked down the hallway. The whispering stopped, and the silence was even more unsettling. I took a few steps into the hall, looking around, but there was no one there, just the dim light and the endless shadows. As I turned to go back into my room, I saw something out of the corner of my eye, a figure standing at the other end of the hall. It was barely visible in the darkness, but I could make out the shape of a person, tall and thin, watching me. I froze, my heart racing, and the figure took a slow step toward me, then another. I backed into my room, slammed the door, and locked it, pressing my back against it as if that would keep the figure out. My hands were shaking, and my breathing was shallow. I didn't know what was going on, but I knew I had to get out of there. I grabbed my bag and headed for the window, hoping I could climb out and make a run for it. But when I pulled back the curtains, I saw that the view outside had changed. The desert and road were gone, replaced by an endless expanse of dark, twisted trees that seemed to go on forever. I blinked, my mind reeling. This didn't make any sense. Just then, I heard a scratching sound at the door, like fingernails scraping against the wood. I turned, my heart pounding as the scratching grew louder, more frantic. I took a step back, feeling trapped, with nowhere to go. The door rattled, and the knob began to turn slowly. I held my breath, waiting, as the door creaked open, but no one was there. The hallway was empty, silent, as if nothing had happened. Then I heard it, a soft, whispering voice, coming from right behind me. I spun around and saw him, the man from the front desk, standing in the corner of the room, his hollow eyes fixed on me. "You shouldn't have come here," he whispered, his voice like dry leaves rustling in the wind. "No one leaves the last stop in." I backed away, pressing myself against the wall, my mind racing. "What do you mean?" I stammered. "I just need gas. I'll leave as soon as I can." The man smiled, a cold, empty smile that sent a chill down my spine. "The guests never leave, they join us." With that, he faded into the shadows, disappearing as if he'd never been there. But the whispering remained, growing louder, filling the room with voices that seemed to come from every direction. I covered my ears, trying to block out the sound, but it only grew louder, more insistent, until it was deafening. I felt dizzy, my vision blurring, and I stumbled toward the door, desperate to escape. I ran down the hall, the whispering following me, filling the air with words I couldn't understand. I burst through the front door and into the night, gasping for air. But when I looked around, I realized I hadn't escaped. The inn was gone, replaced by the endless forest I'd seen through the window, stretching out in every direction. The road, my car, the desert, everything was gone. I was trapped. I stumbled through the trees, the whispering voices following me, growing louder, closer. I ran, not knowing where I was going, just trying to escape. But no matter how far I went, the voices were always there, surrounding me, echoing in my mind. And then I saw them, figures moving through the trees, their pale faces watching me with empty eyes. They were the guests, the ones who had never left. They reached out to me, their hands cold and clammy, pulling me toward them. As their hands closed around me, I realized the truth. I had become one of them, another lost soul, trapped in the last stop in forever. It was a dark, quiet night. I had been driving for hours, the endless stretch of highway seemingly going on forever. The only sound I could hear was the hum of my truck's engine and the soft shuffle of the tires against the pavement. I wasn't in a hurry. It had been a long week of deliveries, and I was heading home after a few too many nights on the road. I'd been keeping an eye on the fuel gauge, and it seemed fine. I hadn't really thought much about it until the truck began to sputter, the engine cutting out with a faint noise. I tapped the gas pedal, thinking it was just a glitch, but the truck stuttered again, and I heard that all too familiar sound, the sound of an engine running low on gas. "Not now," I muttered, glancing at the gauge. It was on empty. I must have missed the sign for the last gas station. Great. I pulled off to the side of the road and turned off the engine. The truck stopped with a soft jerk. There was no sign of civilization for miles, just the dark, empty stretch of road in front of me. The last town I had passed was a good 20 miles back, and there was nothing ahead but more open road. I reached for my phone to check for a gas station nearby. The screen flashed with no signal. That made sense. This stretch of highway was known for having weak reception. I slammed my hand against the steering wheel, frustrated. "What now?" I muttered to myself. I didn't have much choice. I grabbed my flashlight, stepped out of the truck, and looked around. The only light I could see was from the beam of my flashlight cutting through the dark. There was nothing around for miles except trees and the faint outline of a hill in the distance. No signs of life. I didn't want to walk back to the town. It was late, and I was tired. Plus, it was getting colder. I would have to wait until morning or hope someone drove. But something didn't feel right. There was a strange quietness in the air, something heavy. I stood there, scanning the horizon, but it was just endless road, endless trees. That's when I heard it. A faint sound in the distance. A low rumbling sound, like a car or truck driving along the road. Relief washed over me. I could flag them down, get a ride to the nearest. I stood still, holding my flashlight high, hoping they would see me. The sound grew louder, closer. Then, just as I was about to step into the road, the rumbling sound stopped. I froze. The highway was now eerily silent again. My heart began to race. I felt like something was off. The truck had been there, I was sure of it. But there was nothing. No headlights, no. I turned around, suddenly aware of how dark it had gotten. The trees around me seemed to loom larger now, their branches twisting in the wind as though they were reaching for me. I glanced back toward the truck. Maybe I was just overthinking it, the stress of the job catching up with me. Still, I decided to stay close to the truck. I opened the door and sat back inside. My hands were shaking as I reached for the radio. Static. The signal was weak out here. I leaned back in the seat, trying to relax. Just as I was about to close my eyes for a moment, I saw something moving in the distance. At first, it looked like a figure, someone walking along the side of the road. I squinted, trying to get a better look. The figure seemed to be stumbling toward me, moving erratically, its arms swaying in strange motions. It was too far away to make out clearly, but something about the way it moved made my skin crawl. I grabbed my flashlight again, flicking it on. I tried to shine the light in their direction, but the beam barely reached far enough. Then, the figure stopped. It stood still for a long moment. I felt a chill run down my spine. Whoever it was, they were no longer moving toward me. Instead, they were standing in the middle of the road, their head tilted strangely upward, staring at the sky. I could just make out their silhouette, and it didn't look human anymore. It was like they were frozen in place, unmoving, staring at nothing. My hands gripped the steering wheel. What the hell was going on? Was I just tired, seeing things? But no. The figure was real. I could tell. I could feel it in my gut. I wasn't alone. The figure began to move again, this time more deliberately, toward the truck. My heart started to pound. I wasn't sure why, but I had the sudden urge to leave. Fast. I grabbed the keys, threw the truck into gear, and pressed my foot to the gas pedal. The truck lurched forward, but then, nothing. The engine sputtered once more, cutting out completely. I slammed my fists against the steering wheel. "Come on," I shouted into the dark, but the truck was dead. I didn't know what to do. I was stuck, trapped. I looked through the windshield and saw the figure now standing right in front of the truck. I could see it clearly now, an old man, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes wide open, as though in shock. His clothes were ragged, torn at the edges, and he had long, dirty hair. He was standing still, his head tilted as if he was listening to something, but there was no sound except the wind. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. There was something wrong about him, something unnatural. It was like his presence was drawing all the warmth from the air. I fumbled for my phone again, hoping for a signal. Nothing. The figure didn't move. He just stood there, staring at me, his eyes wide open and unblinking. I knew I had to get away, but the truck wouldn't start. Then, without warning, the figure started walking toward me. Slowly at first, his footfalls heavy against the pavement. The closer he got, the more I could see the strange, unnatural stillness in his movements. He was walking as if he wasn't really alive, his body jerking and twitching in odd ways, like something dragging itself through the world. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was frozen, watching as he came closer and closer. My breath was shallow, my chest tight. I had to move. I didn't know what this thing was, but I couldn't stay. I grabbed the flashlight and swung it at the door handle, fumbling with it in a panic. Finally, the door popped open. I jumped out of the truck and bolted into the trees, not daring to look back. I ran as fast as I could, my heart thumping in my chest. I didn't know where I was going, but I had to get away from him. The sound of footsteps behind me was getting louder, but I didn't dare stop. I don't know how far I ran, but eventually I stumbled upon an old cabin, tucked away between the trees. Without thinking, I ran up to the door and yanked it open. Inside, there was a flickering light. The cabin smelled old and dusty, but it was better than being out there in the dark. I slammed the door behind me and collapsed on the floor, gasping for breath. I didn't know who had lived there or what kind of place it was, but for the moment, it was shelter. I glanced around, trying to calm myself, but then I noticed something strange. On the wall was a framed picture, an old black and white photo of a man who looked just like the one I'd seen outside. I froze. The photo was worn and faded, but the man's eyes seemed to stare right through me. The sound of a door creaking open behind me. It was a cold night, and I was tired. The roads were empty, stretching out endlessly before me. I'd been driving for hours and the fuel gauge was almost touching E. I knew I needed to find a gas station soon, but the GPS wasn't showing anything nearby. I was surrounded by pitch black night, just me, the hum of my engine, and the distant headlights every now and then. I glanced at my phone, but it had no signal. I told myself to stay calm. After all, I'd traveled this road before, though it had been years. I knew there had to be a station somewhere along this stretch, and I'd fill up and continue my journey. Finally, as my fuel light flashed and beeped in a low warning, I saw a dim light in the distance. Relief washed over me as the faint glow came into view, illuminating a small sign that read 24-hour gas and food. The place looked run down, with flickering lights and an old metal sign that creaked in the wind. It seemed like a forgotten relic from a different time. I pulled up beside the lone pump, shut off my engine and looked around. No other cars, no attendants in sight, just a dusty, lonely station. I got out of the car and stretched, feeling the cool air prickling my skin. I walked to the pump and lifted the handle, ready to fill up, but nothing happened. I shook the nozzle, tried pressing buttons on the machine. Nothing. Frustrated, I decided to go inside. Maybe the clerk could turn on the pump from the counter. The glass door was dirty, covered in smudges and handprints, and when I stepped inside, a little bell jingled above me. The place was silent, and the air was stale. It felt like no one had been in there for a long time. The lights flickered as I took a look around. The shelves were lined with snacks, most of which looked past their expiration dates, covered in dust. I approached the counter and saw a bell on the desk, the kind you'd ring for service. I pressed it once, then waited, glancing around to see if anyone would appear. A minute passed, then another. I pressed the bell again, this time a bit louder. The silence was starting to get to me. That's when I heard the faint sound of footsteps from the back room. The door behind the counter creaked open, and a man slowly stepped out. His face was pale and his eyes looked dull, like he hadn't slept in days. "Can I help you?" he asked in a low, gravelly voice. Yeah, I need some gas," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "The pump doesn't seem to be working." The man stared at me for a moment, his eyes almost vacant, then nodded slowly. "I'll turn it on. Go back out to your car." I gave him a nod, not sure what else to say, and went back outside. The pump was now working, and I began filling up my tank, watching the numbers on the meter tick by. As the gas flowed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about this place. The air felt heavy, almost like it was pressing down on me. I tried to shrug it off, chalking it up to the late hour and my own exhaustion. When my tank was finally full, I put the nozzle back and went to pay. The clerk was still standing behind the counter, his eyes fixed on me as I entered. "How much do I owe you?" I asked, pulling out my wallet. $20, he replied, his voice flat. I handed him a 20, and as he took it, his cold fingers brushed against mine. I shivered, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the cold night air. His gaze didn't leave me, and I felt an urge to leave as quickly as possible. But just as I turned to go, he spoke. "Be careful out there," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Strange things happen on these roads at night." I looked at him, confused. "What do you mean?" He didn't answer. He just kept staring at me with those lifeless eyes. I felt a sense of unease growing in my chest, but I forced a nod and headed back to my car. As I started the engine and pulled out of the station, I couldn't shake his words from my mind. Strange things happen on these roads at night. The words echoed in my head as I drove down the dark, empty highway. About 15 minutes later, I noticed something strange. I'd been driving in a straight line, but I could swear I saw the same gas station in my rearview mirror. I shook my head, thinking I must have imagined it. But then, just a few minutes later, I saw the faint glow of the station's neon sign up ahead. My heart began to race. There was no way I could have driven in a circle. The road had been straight the entire time. I glanced at the dashboard. My fuel gauge was already dropping again, faster than it should have been. I tried to stay calm, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But as I continued down the road, I saw the same gas station appear in the distance. The same flickering lights, the same creaky sign. It was impossible. I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead as I pulled up to the pump, knowing I'd been there before. Taking a deep breath, I got out of the car and went inside again, hoping maybe I'd missed a turn somewhere or that there was someone who could help me understand what was going on. The bell jingled as I walked in, and I felt a strange sense of déjà vu. The store looked exactly the same as it had minutes before. And then I saw him. The same clerk was standing behind the counter, staring at me with those empty eyes. "Back again?" he asked, his voice low and eerie. I took a step back, my mind racing. I think there's something wrong. I keep ending up here." He just stared at me, unblinking. Like I said, strange things happen on these roads at night. I felt a lump in my throat, and I fought to keep my voice steady. "What's going on? Why can't I leave?" He didn't answer. Instead, he just pointed toward the door. "Best be on your way," he said, a strange, unsettling smile on his face. I wanted to argue, to demand answers, but something in his eyes told me it would be useless. I turned and walked out, feeling his gaze on my back the whole way. As I got back in the car, I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched, not just by the clerk, but by something else. I started the engine and pulled back onto the road, trying to shake off the feeling of dread that was settling over me like a heavy blanket. But no matter how far I drove, the gas station kept appearing. I would see its dim lights in the distance, and no matter how many times I tried to keep driving, I would always end up back there. My fuel was almost gone, and I knew I couldn't keep this up much longer. Finally, after what felt like hours, I pulled up to the station once more, defeated. I sat there in the car, my hands gripping the steering wheel, feeling utterly trapped. I didn't know what to do. Then, I saw something in my rearview mirror. A figure was standing behind my car, shrouded in darkness. I turned around, but there was no one there. My heart pounded in my chest as I looked back at the mirror, and the figure was closer this time, slowly walking toward me. Panicking, I fumbled with the door handle, throwing it open and stumbling out of the car. I ran toward the gas station, hoping the clerk could help me, even if I didn't trust him. I burst through the door, breathless, and looked around. The store was empty. The clerk was gone. I backed up, my eyes darting around, and that's when I saw the figure standing outside, silhouetted against the flickering lights. It was tall and thin, its face obscured by shadows, but as it moved closer, I could make out its eyes. Cold, dark, and filled with malice. I stumbled backward, my mind racing with fear. The figure slowly approached the door, its movements slow and deliberate, as if savoring my terror. I turned and ran to the back of the store, desperately searching for a way out, but every door was locked, every window barred. The lights flickered again, and the store was plunged into darkness. I could hear footsteps, slow and heavy, echoing in the silence. My heart raced as I pressed myself against the wall, praying the figure wouldn't find me. But then, in the darkness, I felt a cold breath against my neck, and I knew it was too late. The last thing I heard was a whisper, a voice as cold as the grave. Strange things happen on these roads at night.